I want to dissuade you and hopefully save you some of your precious life, your time, by going through why Leo Strauss is probably one of the most worthless 20th century philosopher or attempts at philosophy, and why you should consider it not worth your time. If you have no idea who Leo Strauss is, that's quite a good thing. Unfortunately for me, I had to go through and find out who he was during my inexhaustibly curious journey here. And in correspondence to that, I obviously have had to discover his other, you could say, colleagues or brothers and sisters in arms here who all consider themselves in the same anti-Spenglerian position, which is that, yes, Spengler had a lot of good ideas, but they aren't necessarily true. They don't reflect a reality. I don't like his conclusions. This is what you kind of get. So Leo Strauss is just one of the more famous versions of these. And so for anyone who wants a bit of context here, Leo Strauss was what was considered a political philosopher in the 20th century and advocated for something like a Platonic elite political system whereby the elites of a country, which, as you can probably guess looking at this guy who has some of the worst physiognomy I've ever seen, is something where intellectuals will reign supreme in this system. This is very akin to the French, who are also very ugly, wormy, weasel philosophers in the way that they looked around the power structure and how hierarchical power can be for philosopher kings in that way. It's just it's all ressentiment, and I'll go through how he built up on this ressentiment. It's a little bit different to how Kissinger got Spengler wrong, and then Hannah Arendt, who also got Spengler wrong. And the connection here, or the conjoining factor between all of these three is with all Jewish emigres from Germany prior to World War II. And so they all had the same, you could call it an experience around what a power dynamic is in a Weimar and post-Weimar Nazi Germany state. How exactly that goes to inform their political philosophy is very clear. And I think in many cases they learnt a few things that we can consider usable, applicable, but then the rest of it is garbage, and the reason it's garbage is manifold. But in consideration of Leo Strauss specifically, it's because his metaphysical system was total trash, and the way he approaches problems is this Judeo-Christian value system with a lot of ancient Grecian philosophy thrown on top, where you consider him this Neoplatonist almost with regards to how he felt political structures reflected some sort of modernism or postmodernism. Now, anyone who throws the word modernism or postmodernism into a conversation or is sincere about treating it as an idea is a moron from the outset. It's such a buffoon catechism, or like a shibboleth for a retard in these cases. And the recoil effect of saying this is that most people know, how can you say that this is a very serious academic discussing what are very serious topics? Was that the only reason people respect these people is because other people respect these people? If you treat these ideas as they are, singularly, you'll come to the same conclusion I will. This is hogwash and drivel written by someone who's so either megalomania or at least insecure and neurotic that he had a hard time understanding himself as this, why am I a weakling nobody? How do I put myself onto the top of this strata, the apex of the hierarchy here? And that's how we can conjure this up. It's this very simple terms of how do I rewrite history so that I can be what would be considered a winner? And this is very clear that academics in the, I would say, post-Nietzschean era, mostly philosophical academics, structure their philosophy to make them feel good. It's either very vain and superficial in this way, or they try to make it profound, esoteric, and deep. But the functionality is exactly the same. It's this, I have a very poor metaphysical background, and this is manifested in who I am, what I look like, and in that I can then probably try to fight intellectually this feeling of disgust, of ressentiment. And so we start, I guess, by reading what is the start of Leo Strauss's maybe most infamous essay here, where he goes on to say that all political action aims at either preservation or change. When desiring to preserve, we wish to prevent a change to the worse. When desiring to change, we wish to bring about something better. All political action is, then, guided by some thought of better or worse. But thought of better or worse implies thought of the good. The awareness of the good, which guides all our actions, has the character of opinion. It is no longer questioned, but on reflection, it proves to be questionable. The very fact that we can question it directs us towards such a thought of the good as is no longer questionable, towards a thought which is no longer opinion, but knowledge. All political action has then in itself a directedness towards knowledge of the good life, or the good society. For the good society is the complete political good. Now, you can probably have a disposition towards this, and I think it's very telling as to which one you take. If you've read any Spinoza, because I think Leo Strauss probably wishes he was someone similar to Spinoza, then you'll understand that this flows very similarly to his works, particularly on his philosophical works. But the way that he tries to design a logical philosophy on rational premises with corollaries to statements. So in Spinoza's works, he's very similar in how he tries to outline what he feels is the objectively discussable and permissible moral position. And further on in ethics, he goes on to discuss other more mundane topics, which I have no interest in talking about right at the moment. But the idea that Spinoza was able to formulate a system based on this good, on this, and his idea is a god, he's a deist, post-Judaism deist or something like this. And which is probably similar to how Leo Strauss thought about himself. Obviously, he's much more inferior to even Spinoza, who was, as Spengler says, a Magian era philosopher. So his whole metaphysics was built on the Magian idea of becoming and become, rather than the Faustian one. And this is also where Strauss doesn't quite conceptualize, or at least fathom, what Spengler is about. He goes on to become, and I think this is very telling, what Spengler warns us against, this rootless urban intellectual pursuing a worthless function. This idea for Spengler was a warning. It was to say, there is no more philosophy to be had. We have reached the bedrock of philosophy. I've identified all of the trends, all of the threads that have the skeins that have gone back into the start of the Faustian man of the Gothic period, and what exactly it means for us to consider philosophy, but also meaning and why we are here. What's the Faustian destiny? He's highlighted it. And then so he goes on to say there's nothing else to be done about it. You don't need more philosophers. None of the people who are trying to intellectualize these things are worth anything. Their pursuits are worthless. They themselves, by the nature of their pursuits, are worthless. And this is why you get such a strong rejection, this feeling of a seething and a coping from these intellectuals who sometimes like to call themselves intelligentsia or academics or what have you, is because it's a direct attack on their own vocation. They've chosen what they think is the job for them. To say, I believe myself as an academic, or I believe myself as an intellectual who discusses ideas rather than doing anything. And Spengler rejected this even for himself. It's to say that a man of action is always superior in every way to a man of thought. This was very evident throughout the early and late Middle Ages, when you had the two estates. You had the priestly class and the warrior class, and that the priestly class was always trying to over-intellectualize their power so that they could dominate what was the warrior class in a way that was a perpetual battle. But with the introduction of merchant class, then you have the dual battle around who actually owns the social progress of a society. And obviously with Luther and killing what was the Catholic Church in the, I would call, functional part of the Faustian Empire, you have the burning out of the Spanish Catholics, which was the last gasp of anything Catholic from a identitarian or at least a ecclesiastical standpoint. So from there on, you get Protestantism functionally as the dominant, you could say, ecclesiastical school. But even metaphysically, it's not what we would base ourselves in and upon. We aren't Christians first and foremost, as much as some people will try to tell you that they are. If you were, then how can anyone be a Christian? How is it just a denomination for you? What about Christianity is so special to who you are that anyone from Africa or anyone from Philippines or anyone from any country in the world can just be a Christian? I mean, that makes it worthless. It makes it a commodity. The Christianization and the way that the gospel is preached to love every man cannot be held in the same account that there's something special about being Faustian. These two things are irreconcilable. So there is a uniqueness to being Faustian, and this is not understood by at least the three people you see here. And this is not in regards to them being Jewish. I think that's probably incidental, but at the same time, their Jewishness, I think, precludes their ability to understand what a Faustian soul and spirit is. And so maybe it's, if not incidental, then at least cohabitating in the reasoning process. There have been, I think, at least, well, Spinoza was Jewish, and we say he was Magian, but at least Otto Weininger and Wittgenstein were fairly prominent, I think, Jewish ethnicity philosophers who still understood the Faustian pact, the bargain. And so we can't necessarily write them off from that perspective to say, look, they're Hebrews and they wouldn't understand. I think it's very telling that all three have compiled what is fairly rational accounts of Spengler's work and then rejected it based on some very duplicitous premise. Say, no, I don't like this part of Spengler. Thus, Spengler himself has not advocated for a holistic system. They're trying to use what would be a Gödel incompleteness theorem on Spengler's system. It's to say, no, because I reject this part, I can reject the whole. Without any regard to whether it's true or not. It's just more how they feel about it because it's how they are impugned by it. And once you have aspersions cast upon you, you have a natural hostility to those and to that thing. And that's what you do see here. It's this metaphysics of Judeo-Christian and almost Grecian Apollonian feeling, which is a artificial feeling. They're not actually from ancient Greece. So you won't be able to feel as Aristotle or Plato or Socrates actually how they felt. You can't be an Epicurean in the Grecian way. It's not possible. But you'll have intellectuals claim, or at least pretend as if it is. And this is how they form these schools, these intellectual schools, as if it's some very exclusive elite class of people who get something that no one else does. And Leo Strauss was big on this esotericism. It's this an enigmatic way of writing things that only really clued in intellectuals will understand. It's just balderdash. He's being a moron. And it's very superficial. And I think it goes into probably his large vanity. Most ugly men have a complex. Usually it's derived from their spiteful, ugly souls, and it's borne out in their writings and in their style. And this is to a T who Leo Strauss was. You can say his only importance was the influence of the boomer Christian neoconservative. We're better than everyone else. And this is where you get that Judeo-Christian mindset is if you feel yourself as an American, but you intertwine that with being a Christian, you have this dichotomy. And in that you do get what was considered a Southern or at least a conservative from the religious aspect. You would always vote Republican as a conservative Christian because these two things are intertwined in such a delicate or subtle way that you can't disentangle them from your identity very easily. And so someone who's not maybe as well-read or as intelligent or something would go, oh no, of course I'm a neoconservative because the positions advocated for are very reliant on Christian faith, which I believe quite heavily in or attribute my moral ethical standing upon. It's very easy to see how you could tie something written by Strauss into that vein. But at the same token, I think you're just ascribing certain values to someone who has no basis for the values. No metaphysics means there is no value system. And you can see that how he's written out just in this paragraph alone about the better, worse, and the good. If anyone's read Nietzsche, which Strauss had, is that you understand it's beyond good and evil. These things are spooks. They don't exist. Strauss was trying to proffer these like categorizations of action into a moral bucket that doesn't have to exist. Your preconception of what is good or bad is down to whether or not you feel like good and bad are actual concepts worth dealing with. You can just reject them out of hand. It is something that even Gödel knew when he was, that Wittgenstein knew when he was dealing with Gödel's assertion, basically, that God exists and I can prove it using logic. It's to say that you only have to agree to that if you agree to the premise. And if you disagree with the premise, then the proof can work, but the logic is not substantiated by the axioms. And so what's the point? And the point here is that Strauss is living his life on a pretense that he wishes was true, because if it's true, then he's a great thinker and he's an important man of history. And if it's not true, then he's just some wormy academic no one should actually have to listen to, because all his lies, which is what they are, because they're untruths spoken out of a untrue premise, is what flows. And so you have this charlatan here. And I can probably belabor this point to a very boring degree, but I think lastly, to relate them to the others here. So Kissinger, if you are interested, wrote his I think doctoral or bachelor thesis on Spengler, Toynbee, and the organic or historical notion of cyclicality in history. And it's actually fairly well written, particularly for a 22 or 3-year-old, what he was at the time. It's just that his conclusions are never reflective of the Spenglerian feeling. He intellectualizes what is intuition, and in doing so misunderstands why the Faustian need for things is the way that it is. He can't feel it. It's alien to who he is, and that's borne out in the way that he writes it. And so when you deal with Kissinger as the man behind the president, because he was the Secretary of State for many, many years and had international foreign affairs as his primary function of his life's work, you can see that there's this element missing. He was a very smart guy who did some very smart things, but he had an element to his attempted rejection of history to say that, no, we can still address these things as if it weren't on a predestined course, rather than saying, let's embrace destiny and try to manufacture greatness. It was a resistance. He was trying to fight what he thought was the incorrect result. And it's borne out now, international relations, that no matter how long you resist something for, it eventualizes. And so if you are such a coward that you're trying to prevent what is an inevitability, rather than dealing with it when you have the power to address it in the best way possible, then you get someone like Kissinger. This was also true, I think, for World War I. It was an inevitability that the world would come to divide itself along certain lines. It was just waiting for the, you could say, catalyst or the spark to ignite the C4 and to explode what was a lot of hostilities for different reasons against different people. So there was a very easy way to manufacture friends and enemies in that instance. But in general, it's very easy to understand friend and enemy distinctions across time, and also in international politics, how exactly you can go about aligning incentivization and alliances in that way. Lastly is Hannah Arendt, and I won't go too much into her because her philosophy of politics is even worse than Strauss, if you can believe it. And you'll find, I think, in most academic senses in the late 20th century, you have this massive misunderstanding of the course of history, of a rejection of metaphysics from the premise, to say that they tried to, like economics, isolate their school out of what is a holistic way. And Spengler talks a lot about this, as you can't treat these things in isolation, in some sort of vacuum effect, where I have political science here, and I have economics here, and I have science and art, and I have drama and literature here. These things all go to the same degree of importance in the same holistic organism, which is Faustian society. It's this Gothic, Teutonic empire of everything. The reason you think culture is something that, say, white people don't have is because everything else is in contrast to it. The fundamental basis of our reality is Gothic. And from that, then we can understand, okay, so any rejection of the elements of it are necessarily wrong. They're a rebuking of something for a ressentiment reason. It's the person speaking them hates the idea of it because it's a rejection of who they are, because they're not Faustian. There's only one other conflict, and that's the Faustian against themselves. It's the knight versus the Viking. And that's a completely different conflict, which you saw in World War II, Germany versus the Anglosphere. But the alien attacking the Faustian is always something that you can disregard, almost out of hand. And so I think lastly to mention that there's a Peter Thiel essay called The Straussian Moment, where he also references Spengler, and he tries to reconcile Strauss, or at least the Straussian Gregard movement, with Spengler, to say, look, there's a call to destiny that Spengler has. And it's completely and in tune with Strauss and these other Vienna Circle, almost political philosophical schools, which is not true. And so I think Peter Thiel wishes it was true. And I obviously love to educate him on this, but there's this idea that you can have something you like be true alongside of something that you wish was true. And this is how you get cognitive dissonance. And this is how Peter Thiel, in his very long essay here on the effects of what is the politicization of the 21st century, gets it wrong. It's that there is an inevitability to it, but there's also the element of destiny, and you have to treat destiny, you have to treat fate, and you have to treat chance, fortune, as these three distinct elements for what builds into what is the organic destiny of the Faustian man. You cannot have this over-intellectualized theorization of some Judeo-Christian and Apollonian forms and how they all somehow interrelate into current power structures. It doesn't work. These things are not analogous in that way, or that at least they're not able to be developed as premises to that degree. And so my summary here to you is, if you see any of these three names, just discard them. Don't bother.